Hey, students of Music 101, Section 103. Sorry I can't be there in class today, but I have a committee meeting with OTC, one of those things that us faculty have to do every now and then. So we will resume class on Thursday. I've recorded this lecture video with a PowerPoint presentation. Would have been most of what we would have gone over in class today. So hopefully this will help you out. Make sure that you watch this before Thursday. I sent you an email about it. What we're going to be looking at is the section of the Zheng and Imperial China, the dynasties, beginning on page 326 in your textbook. Now, this section will end with the emergence of Republican China in 1911. We're going to cover Communist China on Thursday, as well as the appropriation of ethnic minority music. And while I'm not providing the YouTube links in this, I have made mention whenever there's a piece of music from your listening assignment that is relevant to what we're talking about. I made sure to mention it in there so that you guys can listen to that as we go along. We're going to start with the first earliest mention of the Zheng, and the dynasty that we're going to look at is the Qin dynasty. It's spelled Q-I-N, but pronounced Qin. And we're going all the way back to the 3rd century BCE. The name Zheng has two possible origins, and the first is it could be an onomatopoeia, which means that the term itself, Zheng, sounds like what the timbre of the instrument is when you strike a string, Zheng. Another possible origin for the name Zheng, this word translates roughly to dispute or argument. And it's thought that in the Qin dynasty, two princesses were arguing over a Zheng. And in doing so, the Zheng itself, which was a 25-string instrument, it broke. It broke in half. And when that happened, the emperor was sort of amused by what was going on. And he named the Zheng for this dispute, and the 12-string Zheng became sort of the adaptation of what that is. If you follow the legend further, the two halves, one being 13 strings and the other being 12 strings, the 13-string instrument was a gift then to the Japanese court and became the ancestor of the modern koto, which we saw. And then the 12-string instrument, in addition to being the origin of the Zheng, was also sent to Korea as a gift to that imperial court and became the basis for the Gyeogum there. Again, that's just a legend. All legends aside, the first written mention of the Guzheng or the Zheng dates from the Qin dynasty. And so that's why we start here. Now, the Qin era imperialists, the court, the nobility, they liked the instrument for several reasons. It was loud, it was portable, and it was really adaptable to a lot of musical situations. It started out as an instrument of the masses, and the music that went along with it was sort of instrument of the peasant classes. In this dynasty, it was used mostly as an ensemble instrument. Now, we're going to see it evolve into sort of a solo instrument as we go along. But to start out with, it was an ensemble instrument played with oftentimes drums, clapping, and singing. And it was also started being used for ritual contexts like weddings and funerals. And it was the instrument that became the first brand of popular music in China, meaning that it was music that was for entertainment, a transcended sort of function and purpose. Now, from this time period also, we have two similar instruments that emerged. The first is the Gu Qin and, of course, the Gu Zheng. Now, the Gu Qin was an instrument that was thought to be more for the nobility and the literati and scholars and sages. So it was considered a more refined instrument than the Zheng. The Zheng was pretty loud. It was an instrument of the peasant masses. The Gu Qin was a softer instrument, played more as a contemplative, meditative air. The Guzheng started out with 12 strings. It has since adapted first to 16 strings and now to the modern Zheng, which has 21. The Guqin, which adapted at the same time, sort of maintained its same shape and the same amount of strings. So it continues to only have 7 strings, and it's still played today. The Guzheng and the Guqin are similar instruments, both bored zithers, but they're played in different contexts, and as you see from the pictures down at the bottom, they look different as well, slightly different construction. We listened to some solo Guzheng in class on Thursday last week. If you go to your listening assignment, there is a video, a performance of Tao Tushen, his Guqin performance, and you'll hear the difference between the two. Now, the Guzheng you'll listen to a lot in a lot of the pieces that we have from this listening assignment, but we only have one that features the Guqin, played by Tao Tushen. And so these two instruments sort of developed roughly parallel to each other. Now, we're going to fast forward to the Han Dynasty. And the Han Dynasty was interesting because we start to see the rise of Confucianism. Now, Confucianism is not a religion. There's no deity, there's no religious text or anything like that. Rather, it's more of a philosophy, a way to comport oneself, sort of based on self-betterment, self-reflection, meditation. And of course, everybody knows about the sayings of Confucius. The Zheng became linked to Confucianism in the Han Dynasty. sort of seen as an instrument of meditation. And because of this, the Zheng moved from being an ensemble instrument to more of a solo instrument used for, again, self-contemplation and meditation. The Zheng was also used in more and more ceremonial functions throughout this time as well. And in the Han Dynasty, we start to see that nearly every class of citizen was playing the Zheng. Women and men, the rich, the poor, slaves, the nobility, virtually every class of citizen in China was playing the Zheng. Now we're going to fast forward to the Tang Dynasty, and we're actually jumping a little bit of time here. And the only reason we make jumps is it means that there wasn't a lot that was going on with Zheng development during the intervening time period. So we're going to jump to the Tang Dynasty, 618 of the Common Era, and the Zheng is said to have reached its peak or its apogee in the Tang Dynasty. At the beginning of the Tang Dynasty, China was still consolidating its power. By the middle of the dynasty, by about 800 or so, the Tang Imperial Court employed more than 30,000 musicians and dancers from across the vast empire of China. That's a lot of state patronage of music, and because the state sort of controlled, Zheng development, because they employed so many Zheng musicians, that's really where the developments of the Zheng and its sort of evolution happened. During this era, we moved from a 12-string Zheng to a 16-string Zheng. It increased the range that this instrument could play. The design and the construction were increasingly ornate, especially in the wealthier families of the Tang era. We start to see hardwoods, expensive, coming overland from places like Europe and the Middle East. We see ivory and gold and silver inlays into the material of the instrument itself. We have bridges that are made of jade and other semi-precious stones, ivory from as far away as Africa. During this time, more women were playing the instrument than men also, and so that sort of started a gender association that continues today, of sort of the Zheng being more of a feminine instrument than a masculine instrument. One of the other big things that happened during the Tang Dynasty was the opening up of the Silk Road path. And this was a trading route that connected China to lands as distant as the Arabian Peninsula, Turkey, India, even all the way as far as the Roman Empire and northern Africa there in Egypt. In the early days, China was able to subdue the nomadic enemies that were in the west and the southwest of this region. And that included some of the minorities that we're going to be looking at. It included the Mongolian hordes that were still part of northern China, western China. And this vast trading network, of course, was used mostly for goods, things like hardwoods, ivories, and crops from Europe and from the Middle East, and then silk, tea, gunpowder from China. And so along the Silk Road, we also see an instrument coming from the Middle East that was adapted into China. The instrument in the Middle East is called the oud. We're actually going to see this when we go to the Middle Eastern chapter in the music of Egypt. But it was adapted for Chinese playing, and the adapted instrument in China is called the pipa, which you see a picture of there on the screen. And the pipa, because of its ability to blend so well with the timbre of the Zheng, they became very closely associated during the Tang Dynasty, and that association lasts through to modern times. The pipa and the Zheng are popular duet instruments, and it stemmed from this era of Chinese history. In your listening assignment, the piece Moonlit Night shows you a traditional Zheng and pipa duet, and so that would be a good time to listen to that so you can hear how that pipa sounds with the Zheng. And it's probably an instrument you've heard before, especially if you eat at Chinese restaurants, but you may not have known what it was. Now we're going to jump forward. After the Tang Dynasty was actually the Song Dynasty, but the Zheng itself fell out of favor after the Tang Dynasty in the imperial court and among the wealthier citizens of China. Still very popular among the masses, and much of the music didn't change among the masses of China. But in the nobility and the wealthy classes, the Zheng itself fell out of favor. It wasn't as favored an instrument. But once we hit the Ming Dynasty in about 1368 into the 1400s, it resurged in popularity, and part of this was that a lot of the Chinese citizenry developed a large middle class, quite a large middle class that were wealthy merchants, business owners, traders, not traitors with a T, traders with a D. And with this large Chinese middle class, very similarly to the middle class development in places like Europe and the Americas, a piano was a status symbol. Well, in China, this large middle class, the Zheng, especially heavily designed and ornate Zhengs, were sort of seen as a status symbol. Okay, you were considered a wealthier person if you had a Zheng in the home. And so it became very popular again, and new pieces were written. Regional styles started to develop all across China. When you went into different regions, the playing styles and the compositions were slightly different. Also during this time, we had seen a gender association begin in the Tang Dynasty. But since this instrument was seen as an instrument of refinement, young girls and women were sort of encouraged and pushed into playing it. This was still a patriarchal society. Men dominated China. And when you're trying to marry off your daughter, she has to have, qualifying skills, so to speak, in this time period. Seems misogynistic now, and ladies are probably scoffing at this, but at the time, you had to cook, you had to clean, you had to be able to care for your man and your children. You also should be able to play the Zheng and recite poetry. Crazy, I know. But the Ming Dynasty saw this sort of solidification of women playing the Zheng. We also start to see regional styles develop in Chinese opera and in Zheng playing. We're going to look a little bit more at Chinese opera when we get back to class on Thursday. During this time, a third instrument was also added to the popular Zheng and pipa duet, and that instrument's called the erhu. And you can see it here by itself. It's a two-stringed fiddle that's played with a cello bow, and the timbre of this instrument sort of makes it flute-like. It doesn't sound like a stringed instrument. It sounds more like a wooden flute, and it blended very well with the existing duet. And so this trio of Zheng, pipa, and erhu became very popular during the Ming Dynasty. We'll see a video of that trio when we get back to class on Thursday. Now, the last dynasty that we have before Imperial China sort of ended was the Qing dynasty, and that lasted until about 1911. And in 1911, Zheng Jixi, who is better known in the West as Chiang Kai-shek, it's this beribboned and bejeweled fellow here, he declared China as a republic and ended imperial rule. The final emperor of the Qing dynasty was Henry Puyi, who is this bespectacled fellow here with the weird comb-over haircut. But in this time period of the Qing dynasty, incremental developments were happening in the Zheng. 16 strings developed earlier. We start to see 21-string Zhengs develop during this time. Regional styles became even more differentiated, especially in the realms of opera and in the realm of Zheng playing. And each region sort of had its own what's known as yi jing, or character. Different forms of rhythms and beat structures were developed during this time as well. The regional styles were important and are important to our study because they led directly to the conservatory style that was centralized in the larger Chinese cities of Shanghai and Beijing throughout the 20th century. And so they started gathering up all these different regional styles and sort of centralizing them into a conservatory style, a Zheng conservatory style. Also during this time, because the Zheng was so popular with most of the population of China, it sort of directly led to some of the music propaganda efforts of communist China and Mao Zedong when he declared China as a communist state in the 1940s. And so we sort of see that stem from this era as well. So that sort of ends dynastic China. Make sure that you read this part in the book as well. Don't just rely on this PowerPoint because there were some things that I left out for the sake of time. Had to keep this PowerPoint and lecture under 15 minutes. So we will come back and we'll be looking at communist China and cultural appropriation of ethnic minority music, as well as moving into the 21st century in Chinese music, its associations with rock and regional music, J-pop, K-pop as well. So I hope you have a good middle of your week. I'll see you guys again on Thursday.